In this video, I'm going to highlight some of our collections from the ancient classical world, particularly Egypt, but we've got a few things from Roman and Greek contexts here as well. Often, archaeological materials from the classical world end up in art museums rather than anthropological collections. And indeed, that was the case with this collection originally. Most of the Egyptian materials we have in this collection came from the site of Abydos. They were excavated in the 1910s and donated to the Art Museum here at Cornell. In the 1960s, these materials were transferred to the Anthropology collections, which is where they remain today. The original context was primarily a mortuary site, but given the way that Egyptians treated their dead, burying goods of the living along with them, we find represented among the materials in this collection objects of everyday life, not only objects associated with death. A large part of this collection consists of ceramics in various forms. This is probably representative of what one would find in general in ancient Egyptian contexts. Ceramics were used for a lot of different purposes, and we see that reflected in the materials we have here. You see bowls, jars, storage vessels, vessels that might have been used on a table or a dressing table. One particularly interesting example is this striped ceramic bottle, which, to those who know their Mediterranean ceramics, is clearly a Cypriot piece of pottery. But it came from the site of Abydos in Egypt. It is an example of trade wares, probably traded not merely as a ceramic vessel, but for the contents of the vessel, which might have been an oil, some form of liquid most likely. Some of these ceramics have flat feet so that they'll stand stably on their own, but many are thrown on a wheel with rounded bases. They would not stand on their own. One ingenious solution that the Egyptians came up with in order to get these vessels with rounded bottoms to stand upright was to use support rings that the vessel could be set into. The small ceramic figurines in the shape of mummies are what are known as shabtis, and they would represent assistants to the dead. They would be buried with the mummified person in order to accompany them and serve them in the afterlife. We see here also two actual mummies. Obviously at this size they're not human. The Egyptians mummified many different kinds of animals in addition to people, and what we have here are two different forms. The teardrop-shaped one on the left is actually an ibis. It has been x-rayed, and you can very clearly see the skeleton of the bird folded up on itself with the skull and beak running down the center. The one on the right that looks more elaborate is actually nothing at all. What seems to have happened is that in later periods especially, there was a sort of inflationary action in mummification. One had to have, if one could afford it, many examples of birds and other such things interred alongside the body. And basically, the shops couldn't keep up with demand. They couldn't supply at the price that people wanted to pay enough birds, cats, and so forth. And so they would scrounge up sticks, bits of bone, they would roll up rolls of linen cloth to bulk it up and kind of bundle it all together and make it look like a proper mummy. The round ceramic disc and the two similar pieces with rudimentary heads attached to the top were jar lids. And the ones with the heads in particular, probably the lids of canopic jars, small ceramic jars that would have held the organs, the viscera, the materials that were removed from the body during the mummification process of a person. One of the most common sorts of ceramic artifacts that one finds in Egyptian contexts are oil lamps. And you see here three examples, one with a piece of cotton cloth inserted so that one can see how the wick would have been in the original lamps. Two of the ceramic pieces are fairly crude in appearance, but much more interesting in use than their appearance would suggest. The first, this small sort of subconical, crudely made jar, we believe to have been used for beer fermentation. Now, there are larger vessels used for that purpose as well. This is a smaller example than many, and calling this a beer fermentation vessel is a matter of interpretation. We don't have residue analysis on this to be certain, but we think that's what it would have been used for. And probably the fermented beverage would have been consumed while it was still actively fermenting, very frothy, very yeasty, relatively low in alcohol, probably less about getting inebriated and more about the social forms of sharing beverages. The Egyptians didn't have hops as we use in beer today to give it a bitter quality, but they did use a variety of fruits, herbs, spices, and other materials that would have supplemented the flavor that came from the grain. The second one of these vessels that's more interesting than it seems at first glance is this heavy ceramic jar. Now, this was originally cataloged when it came into the collections as a crude storage jar. And you can see that it is in fact very heavy, crudely made. It has an unfinished base. But there's more to it than that. What this actually is a bread mold. Before the technology of baking in ovens was developed in Egypt, they were already making breads. Now, one can bake breads on a flat, hot surface, griddle cakes, pancakes we do today. And this is essentially an elaboration on that process. What would be done would be to heat up this vessel, or probably in commercial bakeries especially, many vessels like this, in a fire. And because it is so thick and heavy, the walls of the vessel would retain heat very effectively. You would then make up your dough, plop the ball of dough into the vessel, and then cover it either with a flat piece or with another vessel of the same shape end to end, and let the residual heat from the ceramic vessel cook the dough inside, which would rise from the action of yeast, expand to fill the interior, and you would get a conical or a biconical loaf of bread. As with beers, the Egyptians added a variety of materials to their breads: dates and other fruit, seeds, nuts, herbs, and we know this because, of course, they wrote, and we have the recipes. We also have recovered, in some cases, actual specimens of bread that were interred with mummified people, and these breads have been studied by scholars. Unfortunately, we don't have any examples of bread itself here in the anthropology collections at Cornell. Two of the great products of fermentation by yeast, beer and bread, were very important staples in the Egyptian diet. And this stela fragment represents those. It shows a figure raising a drinking horn, and there's another drinking horn shown to his right. The inscription at the top reads in translation, "An offering which the king gives to Osiris, the great god, lord of Abydos, that he may give offerings of bread, beer, flesh, and fowl to the Ka, the spirit, of the overseer of the singers of Ku-Anhur, Amin Yaf-Ib, repeating life." And so it's fitting that beer and bread are both represented in artifacts here in the collections. In addition to ceramics, there are a variety of stone artifacts in the collection, including alabaster jars in various forms, one of which still has the visible remnants of coal, the black powder that was used as eye makeup by the Egyptians. You also see there a small ceramic coal pot with the black residue inside. These funny roundish and cubic stones are polished hard stone grinding stones, most likely used for grinding pigments down to powder, again for use in makeup and such preparations. Of course, as is generally known, the ancient Egyptians were really into body presentation, into maintaining their appearance, and so they used makeup. They worked oils into the skin and hair. They wore jewelry and other forms of body decoration, and we see examples of those sorts of things here as well, in the beads, in a small bronze ring and another, probably an earring, possibly an infant's ring, a bronze amulet, the blue faience scarab amulet probably was worn as a pectoral, worn on the chest, although it may have been part of a pendant on a necklace as well. This funny little spool-shaped piece was probably an ear spool worn through an expanded opening in the earlobe. This wooden comb would have been used for hair maintenance. Even this fine ivory spoon was likely used on the dressing table rather than for eating. Another material that we find represented in this collection is glass, in the form of beads, but also in the form of these elongated vials. We don't really know for sure what these vials were used for, but most likely perfumes, ointments, lotions, sorts of products of relatively high value and relatively fine preparation that would warrant the use of a fine and delicate material like glass. These vials probably worked like modern medical ampules, where they would be sealed shut once the contents were in place, and then broken open by the final consumer in order to get to the contents. This would provide some measure of guarantee to the consumer that the products were as warranted by the seller. Of course, people have been fascinated by ancient Egypt for a long time. The Greeks and Romans themselves were interested in Egypt, in the arts and other knowledge developed there. Egyptomania is a term that's often used for this fascination, and it's represented here from several periods. The Victorian period in England in the 19th century was one period of fascination with ancient Egypt, and we see examples of Egyptian design brought into everyday objects like this biscuit tin, which originally held biscuits made by Huntley and Palmers of Reading and London. The two brooches at the back here date to the 1910s or 1920s, another period of great interest in Egyptian motifs. Even in the mainly Western movement of Art Deco, we see Egyptian influence, and particularly at times the use of scarabs. The brooch at the front is a later 20th century example, sold at the Metropolitan Museum of Art along with the exhibition of King Tut when he traveled here for the first time. And then there's an early 21st century example, a Christmas tree ornament that showed up at Target one year in the form of the death mask of King Tut. In addition to the Egyptian materials, we have some examples from other classical Mediterranean traditions here in the anthropology collections. There's a small collection of Hellenistic materials, including mainly ceramics. In addition to the red and black wares that are probably most familiar, there's a nice small collection of pre-classical figurines, including these people and horse and mounted rider. We also have a small collection of Bronze Age materials, mainly Roman, including sewing needles, tweezers, a fibula or pin, basically like a modern safety pin. One of the more unusual pieces today is this strigil, which looks like a sort of elongated spoon, but would have been used in the baths. Basically, you would anoint yourself with olive oil and use that to loosen and float any dirt that might be in your skin, and it then could be removed by scraping down with the strigil, leaving one clean and refreshed. Bronze was also widely used for weapons, and this brings about one of my favorite juxtapositions of cultures represented in the collections. We have bronze swords, battle axe, triangular arrow points. These were weapons that might have been carried not only by Roman legionnaires, but by others who had access through trade networks to obtain them. In Northern Europe, in Denmark in particular, the Neolithic peoples there, not having yet the use of bronze, were coming into contact with others who did have access through trade networks to bronze goods. And they used their great skills as flint knappers to produce flaked stone equivalents of those bronze tools. And so we see flaked stone daggers, flaked stone battle axes, even flaked stone triangular arrow points. Some of the flints available in that area were yellowish, and there was some selection of those so that the color would be similar to bronze. And some of the pieces, after they had been flaked to shape, were then ground and polished to a smooth, glossy surface, making them as much like metal as possible in the absence of the technology of working with metals. It's important to remember when looking at ancient cultures like Egypt, like the Romans, that these did not exist in a vacuum, that they were contacting a variety of other cultures and traditions, people who lived in other kinds of ways. And they sometimes borrowed traditions, technologies, ideas from those people, and those people sometimes borrowed ideas and technologies and traditions from the Bronze Age, from the Romans, from the Egyptians, and so forth. As interesting as ancient Egypt itself is, for me, it's these kinds of cultural interactions that are the most exciting thing to consider in thinking about the ancient past.